Canadian government file still lists this case as unsolved, and it involves a man who walked out of the woods with a grid of burns branded straight through his shirt. This is the story of Stefan Michalak, a mechanic who went looking for silver in the Manitoba wilderness, and came back with a story the Royal Canadian Mounted Police could never fully explain. Doctors treated his burns. The military tested his soil. Nobody, not the police, not the Air Force, not even the Skeptics, ever closed the file for good. What happened to him out there still doesn't add up. On the morning of May 20th, 1967, Stefan Michalak headed into Whiteshell Provincial Park, about 100 miles east of Winnipeg. He was 51, an industrial mechanic by trade, and on weekends he liked to hunt for quartz and silver along the rocky shield near Falcon Lake. He'd already staked a mineral claim there the year before. That morning he was alone, tapping at rock near a vein of quartz, when a flock of geese exploded into noise above him. He looked up to see what had spooked them. What he described next is the reason people still talk about this case. Michalak said he saw two cigar-shaped objects glowing red, hovering close together in the sky. One flew off. The other dropped down and landed on a flat outcrop of rock nearby. He watched it sit there, silent, for several minutes. Michalak was curious rather than scared. He walked closer, close enough to see a door open on the side of the object, and close enough to hear what he later swore were human voices coming from inside. He tried speaking to it in English, Russian, and a couple other languages, hoping someone would answer. Nothing did. Then he reached out and touched the hull. He said the metal was warm, almost soft, and it melted the fingertips of his glove on contact. That's when the object started to rotate, and that's when things went wrong fast. As the craft spun, Michalak claims he saw a grid of small holes along its side, and a blast of hot air or gas shot out of them, hitting him square in the chest. The force knocked him backward. His shirt and cap caught fire. He tore the burning clothes off his body while the object lifted off and disappeared into the sky, leaving him alone on the rock with burns spreading across his stomach. He made his way back toward the highway, and that walk out of the bush is where the story stops being just his word. A highway patrolman named Constable Solotki spotted Michalak that afternoon, and later filed a report noting visible burns on his cap, along with marks on his skin. Though Michalak refused to show him the shirt, worried he might be spreading radiation, Solotki figured he might be hungover. Michalak insisted he hadn't touched alcohol, though hotel staff later told police he'd had a few beers the night before. That contradiction would follow the case for decades. What nobody could argue with was what happened once he reached a hospital. That night in Winnipeg, doctors at the Misericordia Health Center treated Michalak for first-degree burns across his chest and stomach. Within days, those burns weren't healing like ordinary ones. They swelled into raised, evenly spaced marks, an actual grid pattern that lined up with the holes he said he saw on the craft. He lost 13 pounds in 3 days from vomiting and nausea. He complained of headaches, a strange metallic taste in his mouth, and a smell that wouldn't leave him. A civilian investigator photographed his torso and documented blistered, blotchy burns, unlike any normal injury. Whatever caused them, his body kept reacting to it for more than a year. By 1968, the marks were still coming back, and that's when the case stopped being a local curiosity and became a federal one. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Royal Canadian Air Force, Canada's Department of Health, and the Department of National Defence all opened files on Michalak. The RCAF flew an aerial search over the site, followed by RCMP officers on the ground, hunting for scorched earth or wreckage. At first they came up empty. Michalak had promised to lead them to the landing spot, but instead he went back alone with a partner and collected evidence himself: a burnt shirt, a length of steel tape and soil samples, against direct instructions not to touch anything. When Canadian officials tested his soil, it came back as highly radioactive. That result got their attention fast. Investigators swept his home for contamination and pressed him to finally take them to the site. At the location, they found a semicircle of ground where the moss had been stripped away, like something had scorched or scraped it clean. Radiation tests on the surrounding rock came back with only trace levels, not enough to explain his soil sample. Chemists floated a theory that the site or his samples had picked up contamination from radium-based paint, common enough at the time for glow-in-the-dark instruments. A separate piece of metal Michalak later handed over, tested as 95% silver, with a faint radioactive signature, which one government scientist suggested had simply been dipped in a radioactive mineral to fake the trace. None of that fully explained the burns, and none of it fully debunked them either. The Department of National Defense eventually wrote in an internal memo that the origin of the radioactivity could not be determined, and that neither their team nor the RCMP could produce any evidence disproving Michalak's account. Government officials refused to release the full report to the public, which only fed the suspicion that something bigger was being kept quiet. By 1968, Michalak's health was still unraveling, so he traveled to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. A psychiatrist there examined him and reported finding no real evidence of mental illness, calling him a grounded, practical man, not someone prone to invention. But that same year, a doctor also described his newest set of grid burns as looking self-inflicted, a possibility Michalak always denied. So the case splits right down the middle. Skeptics believe he staged the whole thing to scare off rival prospectors from his mining claim, and point to the drinking, the missing gear, and the inconsistencies in his story. Believers point to the documented burns, the radioactive soil, the scorched ground, and the fact that trained investigators from two governments spent months on this and still couldn't call it a hoax. Michalak died in 1999, still telling the same story he told that highway patrolman back in 1967. He never changed a single detail. Canada's Department of National Defense still classifies the Falcon Lake Incident as unsolved. More than half a century later, one of the only UFO cases their government ever formally investigated and never closed. Somewhere in an archive in Manitoba sits a burnt undershirt with a grid pattern nobody has ever been able to fully explain. If this kind of case gets under your skin, that unsettled feeling where the file just stays open forever, hit like and subscribe so more of these come your way. Echoes After Dark digs up the strange cases that governments actually investigated and still couldn't close. So there's plenty more where this came from. Drop a comment with the case that still keeps this crew up at night. And share this with the one friend who needs to hear about the man who touched a UFO and never stopped burning for it.